Tonight, we begin the Marineford Arc, the great war that shook the world of One Piece and changed the age of pirates forever. Before we begin, please kindly like this video and subscribe to the channel for more peaceful, immersive anime retellings. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let the story begin. Morning spread across the sea surrounding Marineford, touching the water with pale light. From a distance, the island fortress looked calm and unshaken. Its white walls rose high above the harbor, and the enormous symbol of the Marines stood proudly over the buildings gathered beneath it. Yet inside those walls, the air felt heavy. Warships surrounded the island in carefully arranged formations. Cannons faced the open bay, their barrels waiting in silence. Soldiers filled the courtyards, streets, and defensive platforms, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the banners of the world government. 100,000 elite Marines had been summoned from every corner of the sea. Some had fought pirates for decades. Others were young officers facing their first great battle. All of them understood why they had been brought there. Before the day ended, Whitebeard might come. At the center of Marineford stood a tall execution platform overlooking the entire plaza. Two guards slowly led Portgas D Ace up the steps, his hands bound behind his back with sea stone restraints. Ace's body showed the exhaustion of imprisonment, but he continued walking without resistance. His dark hair moved softly in the sea breeze, and the beads around his neck rested against his bare chest. When he reached the top, the guards forced him to his knees. From there, Ace could see everything. He saw the endless rows of Marines below. He saw the admirals waiting near the front of the battlefield. He saw the warlords of the sea standing apart from the soldiers, each one summoned to defend the government against the approaching pirate fleet. Admiral Aokiji sat with his usual quiet manner, appearing almost relaxed despite the army gathered around him. Admiral Kizaru watched the bay with an unreadable expression. Admiral Akainu remained completely still, his face hardened by his belief that every pirate standing against the government deserved destruction. Nearby stood Dracul Mihawk, the greatest swordsman in the world. His enormous black blade rested behind him, while his sharp eyes remained fixed upon the distant sea. Don Quixote do Flamingo smiled, as though the coming battle were a performance prepared for his amusement. Bartholomew Kuma stood without movement or emotion. Boa Hancock waited among them as well, though her thoughts were not with the Marines. Only a short time earlier, she had secretly helped Monkey D. Luffy enter the underwater prison of Impel Down. She did not know whether he had survived, but she continued hoping that somewhere beyond Marineford, Luffy was still moving toward his brother. At the rear of the plaza waited the Marine Vice Admirals, and among them stood Monkey D. Garp. To most of the soldiers, Garp was a hero. He was the legendary Marine who had fought Gold D. Roger many times. He had pursued the Pirate King across the seas, survived countless battles, and become one of the most respected men in the history of the Navy. But as Garp looked toward the execution platform, none of those victories brought him comfort. Ace was not simply another pirate. Garp had watched him grow from a stubborn child into a powerful young man. He had tried to guide him toward the Marines, argued with him, worried about him, and cared for him as part of his own family. Now Ace knelt in chains before the entire world. Fleet Admiral Sengoku stepped forward. The sound of the crowd slowly faded as he approached the edge of the platform. Transponder snails carried the image of Marineford across the seas, allowing people throughout the world to witness the execution. Sengoku looked down at Ace. He asked the prisoner to reveal the name of his father. Ace raised his head. "My father is Whitebeard." The answer carried across the plaza. Sengoku did not accept it. He explained that the government had searched for a child connected to the Pirate King after Roger's death. Every possible mother, every newborn, and every family tied to him had been investigated. But one woman had hidden the truth. Portgas D had carried her child for 20 months, using impossible strength to prevent the government from discovering when Roger's son would be born. Her effort protected the child, but it cost Rouge her life. Sengoku turned toward the watching world. Ace's true father was not Whitebeard. He was Gold D. Roger. A stunned silence spread across Marineford. The son of the Pirate King had survived. He had grown older beneath another name, joined the Whitebeard Pirates, and risen to become the commander of their second division. To the world government, Ace was not merely a dangerous pirate. He was the surviving bloodline of the man who had begun the great pirate era. His execution was meant to end that bloodline before it could inspire another generation. Ace lowered his head. He had spent much of his life wondering whether he deserved to exist. The world hated the father he had never known, and that hatred had followed Ace long before anyone discovered who he truly was. Yet the name Gold D. Roger did not feel like the name of his father. The man Ace called father was somewhere beyond the horizon. Edward Newgate. Whitebeard. Far from Marineford, the waters remained strangely still. The Marines continued watching the empty bay, waiting for the first sign of movement. Beneath the surface, hidden from every soldier and lookout above, enormous ships were already drawing closer. Ace remained kneeling beneath the open sky, while the truth of his birth spread across the world. Below him, thousands of Marines whispered among themselves. Some stared upward in disbelief. Others tightened their grip upon their weapons, as though the revelation had made the prisoner before them even more dangerous. To the government, Ace was the son of Gold D. Roger. To Ace, that name had always been a burden. He had grown up hearing strangers curse the Pirate King. Men spoke about Roger as though he had been evil beyond measure, someone whose bloodline should never have continued. When Ace was still young, he often asked whether the child of such a man deserved to live. He never received an answer that gave him peace. Garp had cared for him from childhood, but Ace was difficult, angry, and unwilling to accept kindness easily. He believed that anyone who learned the truth about his father would eventually hate him. That fear remained even after he became a pirate. Ace left his home and formed the Spade Pirates, sailing beneath his own flag and searching for a place where his life might mean something. His strength grew quickly. He became known across the seas, and before long, his path carried him toward the most powerful pirate of the age, Edward Newgate, Whitebeard. Ace did not approach him as a son. He approached him as an enemy. Whitebeard was already known as the man closest to the One Piece. His name commanded respect throughout the New World, and his crew treated him with a loyalty Ace did not understand. Ace believed defeating him would prove that he had created a name separate from Roger. Their first meeting ended quickly. Whitebeard overwhelmed him. Rather than kill Ace and his crew, Whitebeard brought them aboard the Moby Dick. He offered Ace a place among his family and told him that he could become one of his sons. Ace rejected the offer. He tried to kill Whitebeard again and again. Each time, Whitebeard stopped him without hatred. Ace attacked while Whitebeard ate. He attacked while the old pirate rested. He attacked from behind, from above, and whenever he believed he had found an opening. None of it worked. Whitebeard defeated him every time. The crew eventually stopped treating Ace like a prisoner. They spoke to him, laughed around him, and allowed him to share their meals. Marco explained that the men aboard the ship had not followed Whitebeard because they feared him. They followed him because he had given them a family. Many had come from places where they possessed nothing. Some had been abandoned. Some had lost everyone they loved. Whitebeard accepted them all. He did not demand that they forget their pasts. He simply allowed them to call him Father. Ace resisted the word for a long time. He had spent years wondering whether the blood inside him made his life a mistake. Accepting another father felt almost impossible. Then Whitebeard asked him a simple question. He wanted to know whether Ace had been happy living beneath Roger's shadow. Ace could not answer. Whitebeard did not ask him to praise the Pirate King. He did not ask him to forgive the father he had never known. He told Ace to choose his own life. Slowly, Ace stopped trying to kill him. He began fighting beside the crew instead of against them. He learned their names, shared their victories, and protected them when danger appeared. Before long, Ace accepted the position of commander of the 2nd Division. The Spade Pirates became part of Whitebeard's family, and for the first time, Ace found a place where his existence did not need to be justified. Whitebeard did not care whose blood flowed through him. He cared only that Ace was his son. That was why Ace had answered Sengoku as he did. His father was Whitebeard, not the man whose name the world feared, not the pirate king whose blood had condemned him before birth. His father was the man who had given him a home. Upon the execution platform, Garp climbed the steps and sat beside him. The old Marine did not speak at first. He looked out across the sea, keeping his face turned away from Ace. Garp had known the truth from the beginning. Before Roger's execution, the Pirate King had entrusted his unborn child to the Marine who had fought him for years. Roger believed that a newborn child should not be punished for the crimes of his father. Garp had honored that request. Now he sat beside Ace while the government prepared to undo everything he had once protected. Ace asked why Garp had not stopped him from becoming a pirate. Garp's voice became rough with emotion. He had wanted Ace and Luffy to become Marines. He had trained them harshly, shouted at them, and tried to push them toward the path he believed would keep them safe. But neither boy had followed it. Ace lowered his head. He did not ask Garp to save him. He knew the old man was surrounded by duty, history, and the eyes of the entire world. Below them, Sengoku continued preparing the execution. Beyond the walls of Marineford, the sea remained silent. Then the water inside the bay began to move. Small ripples spread across the surface. The Marines watched carefully, but no ships appeared on the horizon. The enemy was not approaching from the open sea. Deep beneath the harbor, the Moby Dick continued rising. The water inside Marineford's bay continued to tremble. At first, the movement seemed small enough to ignore. A few ripples passed between the warships, spreading across the surface beneath the watchful eyes of the Marines. Then, the entire harbor began to rise and fall, as though something enormous were breathing beneath it. Lookouts searched the horizon. Shapes had appeared beyond the fortress walls. Dozens of pirate ships surrounded Marineford from the open sea, each carrying one of the Allied crews that sailed beneath Whitebeard's protection. Their captains had answered his call from across the New World, bringing thousands of pirates to rescue Ace. The Marines had expected them to approach through the main entrance. Instead, the Allied fleet stopped outside the bay. Sengoku's expression tightened. The most important ship was still missing. There was no sign of the Moby Dick. A deep shadow moved beneath the water, directly in front of the execution platform. Bubbles began rising around the marine warships. Soldiers stepped back from the edge of the plaza as the sea swelled upward, carrying something immense toward the surface. A coated ship burst out of the harbor. Water poured from its sides as the enormous white vessel rose into the center of the bay. Its bow curved like the head of a great whale, and the flag of the Whitebeard Pirates moved above its deck. The Moby Dick had entered Marineford from beneath the sea. 3 additional ships surfaced around it, each protected by the same coating that had allowed the fleet to travel underwater and pass beyond the Marines' defenses. The pirates had not entered through the gates of justice. They had sailed beneath them. The Marines stared in stunned silence. Across the decks stood the commanders of the Whitebeard Pirates. Marco waited near the front, calm and watchful. Jozu stood like an unmoving wall, his enormous body prepared for battle. Vista rested a hand near his swords, while the other commanders gathered behind them. Thousands of pirates filled the ships. They had crossed the sea knowing that many of them might never return. At the center of the Moby Dick, a massive figure slowly rose from his seat. Edward Newgate stood taller than nearly every man around him. A white coat rested across his broad shoulders, and a long, curved mustache framed the face known throughout the world. Several medical tubes had once been connected to his body. Now they were gone. Whitebeard had come to war without them. He carried his great Bicento in one hand and stepped toward the front of the ship. The wooden deck creaked beneath his weight. Every Marine in the plaza understood who had arrived. This was one of the 4 emperors, the strongest man in the world, the pirate who had once stood as an equal to Gold D. Roger. Whitebeard lifted his gaze toward the execution platform. Ace looked down from above. For the first time since being brought into the plaza, the calm expression on his face began to break. Whitebeard called to him across the battlefield. His voice carried over the ships, the soldiers, and the stone walls of Marineford. He asked whether Ace was safe. Ace struggled against the emotion rising inside him. He had known that Whitebeard might come. He had feared it every day since his capture. The execution had been prepared not only to kill him, but to lure Whitebeard and his entire family into a world against the world government. Ace shouted for them to leave. He told Whitebeard that his capture had been his own mistake and that no one should die because of him. Whitebeard did not accept that. He reminded Ace that he had been ordered to pursue Blackbeard. The words were not entirely true. Ace had chosen to hunt Teach against Whitebeard's wishes, driven by his responsibility as the commander of the division Teach had betrayed. But Whitebeard claimed the decision as his own, refusing to let Ace carry the blame alone. Behind him, the pirate commanders supported their captain's declaration. They had not crossed the sea because Ace had forced them to come. They had come because he was their brother. Whitebeard planted the end of his Bicento into the deck. He raised both arms and clenched his fists against the empty air beside him. For one quiet moment, nothing happened. Then, cracks appeared in the sky. The air itself seemed to fracture around Whitebeard's hands. The sea surrounding Marineford tilted violently, lifting the warships and pulling the water away from the island. The power of the tremor fruit passed through the ocean. Far beyond the fortress, 2 enormous walls of water began rising toward the sky. They grew higher than the marine buildings and wider than the island itself, forming twin tsunamis that approached Marineford from opposite directions. Soldiers looked upward as the sunlight disappeared behind them. The war had barely begun, and Whitebeard had already placed the entire fortress beneath the shadow of the sea. The twin tsunamis rose above Marineford like walls at the edge of the world. Thousands of Marines looked upward as the enormous waves curved over the fortress. For a moment, the entire battlefield seemed destined to vanish beneath the sea before a single sword had been drawn. Admiral Aokiji moved first. He rose from his chair and launched himself into the air, stretching both arms toward the approaching waves. Spears of ice shot from his hands and pierced the water on either side of the island. Cold spread through the tsunamis in an instant. The waves froze where they stood, becoming towering mountains of ice suspended above Marineford. The danger passed, but the frozen water now surrounded the bay with vast cliffs that blocked much of the open sea. Aokiji continued downward. He aimed his freezing power directly at Whitebeard, sending a narrow attack toward the deck of the Moby Dick. Whitebeard cracked the air with a swing of his arm, shattering the ice before it could reach him. The broken pieces fell into the harbor. Aokiji landed upon the surface and froze the entire bay beneath his feet. Water hardened from one end of the harbor to the other, trapping the Whitebeard ships in place. Yet the ice also created solid ground between the pirates and the execution platform. Whitebeard's forces leaped from their ships. The Allied captains charged beside them, filling the bay with raised weapons and roaring voices. Cannon fire thundered from the fortress walls as the Marines rushed forward to meet them. The frozen harbor became a battlefield. Swords struck rifles, spears crossed with axes. Pirates and Marines collided in long lines beneath the shadow of the frozen tsunamis. Ace watched from above as men he knew poured into the war for his sake. Every familiar face deepened the weight inside him. These were the people who had eaten beside him, laughed with him, and sailed through storms at his side. Now they were risking their lives against the strongest military force in the world. Admiral Kizaru looked toward Whitebeard. Light gathered around his body, and he vanished from his seat in a sudden golden flash. He appeared high above the battlefield, preparing to fire directly at the old pirate standing upon the Moby Dick. Marco intercepted him. Blue flames spread from the commander's body as his arms transformed into great wings. He flew through Kizaru's attack, allowing the beams of light to pass through the regenerative fire surrounding him. Marco reached the admiral and struck him with a powerful kick. Kizaru was thrown downward, crashing into the stone below. Light scattered from the impact before his body reformed without any lasting injury. Neither fighter appeared surprised. The war had brought together people whose strength seemed almost impossible to ordinary soldiers. Nearby, Dracul Mihawk slowly drew the black blade from his back. He had come to measure the distance between himself and Whitebeard, the man the world still called its strongest. Mihawk swung once. A vast green slash crossed the frozen bay, cutting through the air and racing directly toward Whitebeard's ship. Marines and pirates alike moved away from its path, unwilling to stand before the greatest swordsman's attack. Whitebeard did not move. Diamond Jozu stepped in front of him. The commander transformed his body into shining diamond and caught the enormous slash against his arms. The force pushed him backward across the ice, carving deep lines beneath his feet. Then Jozu lifted the attack and deflected it upward. Mihawk's slash disappeared into the sky. The watching soldiers understood what the commanders represented. Whitebeard was not protected by ordinary pirates. Each division leader possessed the strength to confront warriors known across the entire world. Jozu tore an enormous block of ice from the frozen harbor. He lifted it above his head and hurled it toward the marine plaza. The mass was larger than a warship, casting a broad shadow over the soldiers below. Admiral Akainu finally moved. His arm became molten magma, glowing with heat strong enough to distort the air around him. He launched a burning fist upward. The attack struck the falling ice. Steam and fire exploded across the sky as the entire block melted before reaching the ground. Drops of boiling water rained over the battlefield. The magma fist continued beyond the ice, breaking apart into burning stones that fell toward the Whitebeard ships. Pirates scattered as fire struck the frozen bay. Whitebeard remained upon the deck, watching the battle unfold. He had not yet stepped onto the ice. The commanders were opening the path, testing the admirals, and pushing the marine lines backward. But both sides understood that the strongest fighters had only begun to move. High above them, Ace remained chained upon the execution platform. Between him and the family that had come to save him stood the full power of Marine headquarters. Across the frozen bay, the battle grew louder with every passing moment. Cannon fire rolled over the ice, swords struck against steel, and the cries of thousands of fighters blended into one unbroken roar. Then, a shadow larger than any warship moved among Whitebeard's allied fleet. Little Oars Jr. stepped forward, towering above pirates, marines, and even the giant soldiers gathered near the plaza. His enormous eyes remained fixed upon the execution platform where Ace knelt in chains. Ace recognized him immediately. Oars was not merely one of Whitebeard's allied captains. He was a friend who had once shared quiet days with Ace beneath the open sky. Because of his enormous size, Oars had always been exposed to the heat of the sun, unable to find ordinary shelter. Ace had learned how to make a wide woven hat and had given it to him as a gift. Oars had treasured that simple kindness, remembering the man who had thought about his comfort when few others ever had. Now, Oars pushed through the battlefield with only one purpose. He would not allow Ace to die. Marine cannons fired upon him, but he continued walking as explosions burst against his body. He lifted an entire warship from the frozen bay and hurled it aside, scattering the soldiers who tried to block him. The Marine Giant Squad moved forward together, surrounding the descendant of the ancient giant known as Oars, yet even they appeared small beside him. The giants attacked with enormous swords and axes. Oars met them head-on, knocking their weapons away and forcing his way closer to the plaza. Each step cracked the ice beneath his feet. Whitebeard's pirates followed the opening he created, but Ace could see the wounds spreading across Oars's body. He shouted for his friend to stop, knowing that the giant was moving directly into the range of the warlords waiting near the front. Bartholomew Kuma raised his hands. Air gathered between his paw-shaped palms, compressed again and again until it formed a small sphere filled with terrible force. Kuma released the pressure directly toward Oars. The resulting shockwave exploded across the giant's body, tearing through the battlefield and shaking Marineford. Smoke covered Oars from head to foot, but when it cleared, he was still trying to move. Don Quixote do Flamingo watched him approach with an amused smile. Invisible strings moved from his fingers and sliced through Oars's right leg. The giant fell heavily to one knee, his blood spreading across the ice. Yet he refused to turn away. Using his arms and his remaining leg, Oars dragged himself forward, reaching toward Ace while the execution platform remained painfully close. Gecko Moria stepped into his path. The warlord had once stolen the corpse of Oars's ancestor and used it to create a monstrous zombie upon Thriller Bark. Now, he looked upon Little Oars Jr. with the same greedy fascination. Moria shaped his shadow into a long spear and drove it through the giant's body. Oars shuddered beneath the impact, but even then, his hand continued reaching toward the platform. Ace cried out his name. Oars stretched his arm as far as he could, his fingers nearly reaching the stone wall beneath Ace before the strength finally left him. His enormous body collapsed across the battlefield, opening a path deeper into the bay, but falling just short of the friend he had come to save. High above him, Ace lowered his head, unable to stop the tears gathering in his eyes. The war had only begun, and one of his brothers had already given nearly everything for the hope of bringing him home. Little Oars Jr. lay motionless across the battlefield, his enormous hand still stretched toward the execution platform. Smoke drifted from the wounds covering his body, and the ice beneath him had turned dark with blood. For a moment, Ace could see nothing except the fallen friend who had crossed the sea for him. Then another sound reached Marineford, a distant cracking from high above the frozen bay. Soldiers lifted their heads. Near the top of one of the enormous waves Aokiji had frozen, a marine battleship had become trapped within the ice. The vessel tilted slowly forward, carrying a strange collection of passengers who had escaped together from Impel Down. Luffy stood among them, with Jinbei, Emporio Ivankov, Crocodile, Buggy, Mr. 1, Mr. 3, and hundreds of freed prisoners. They had reached Marineford at last, but there was no gentle path down to the battle below. The ice holding the ship gave way. The entire vessel slid from the frozen wave and fell through the sky, turning as its passengers clung desperately to the deck. Cries of terror echoed over the battlefield. The ship struck the water and shattered part of the frozen surface, throwing bodies, wood, and broken sails into the bay. Luffy plunged beneath the sea, his devil fruit power immediately draining the strength from his body until Jinbei dove after him and carried him back toward the surface. One by one, the escapees emerged from the broken water and climbed onto the ice. Marines stared in confusion at the impossible group now standing before them. A former warlord, a revolutionary commander, escaped criminals, and the future Pirate King's loudest self-proclaimed rival had all arrived together. Buggy quickly imagined the fame that awaited him if the world saw him standing in the center of the war, while the prisoners who worshipped him cheered as though their captain had planned the dramatic entrance himself. Luffy heard none of them. The moment Jinbei placed him upon the ice, he began searching the fortress. His eyes passed over the admirals, the warlords, and the endless rows of marines until they finally reached the platform above the plaza. There, kneeling between the executioners, was Ace. Every sound around Luffy seemed to disappear. He had crossed Amazon Lily, entered the depths of Impel Down, survived Magellan's poison, and forced his exhausted body onward for this one moment. "Ace!" The cry traveled across Marineford. Ace raised his head, scarcely believing the voice he had heard. Far below him stood the younger brother who should never have been anywhere near this war. Luffy was bruised, poisoned, exhausted, and surrounded by enemies who could defeat him with ease. Yet he had still come. Ace shouted for him to leave. He insisted that this was his own life, his own failure, and his own punishment. He could not bear the thought of Luffy dying beside everyone who had already risked themselves for him. Before Luffy could advance, Crocodile turned his attention toward Whitebeard. The former warlord had agreed to escape Impel Down because Marineford offered him another chance to challenge the emperor he had once failed to defeat. He rushed toward the Moby Dick with his hook raised, but Luffy intercepted him, using the water still covering his body to strike Crocodile before the sand could reach Whitebeard. Luffy warned him that he would not allow anyone to attack the man Ace respected as his father. Whitebeard looked down at the young pirate standing between him and Crocodile. He recognized the straw hat that had once belonged to Shanks and understood that this reckless boy was Ace's brother. Whitebeard warned Luffy that a battlefield of this scale was no place for someone so inexperienced, and that he would likely lose his life if he continued. Luffy did not retreat. He pointed toward Ace and declared that he would rescue his brother. And when Whitebeard challenged his ambitions, Luffy answered that he, not Whitebeard, would become the Pirate King. Then he turned toward the execution platform and began running into the war. Luffy ran across the frozen bay without looking back. Before leaving Whitebeard's side, he warned the old pirate that he had overheard the Marines discussing Ace's execution. The appointed time had been moved forward. Sengoku intended to carry out the sentence before Whitebeard's forces could break through the defenses surrounding the plaza. Whitebeard understood immediately. The Marines were not merely waiting for the pirates to attack. They were shaping the battle around a hidden plan, drawing everyone deeper into the bay while the execution platform remained protected behind layers of soldiers. Whitebeard ordered his commanders and allied captains to support Luffy's advance. The young pirate had no fleet of his own beside him and no experience fighting in a war of this scale. Yet he possessed the one thing no one else upon the battlefield could match. He would continue moving toward Ace, no matter who stood before him. Sengoku watched Luffy charge through the Marine ranks. The Straw Hat pirate had already invaded Eni's lobby, struck a celestial dragon, survived Impel Down, and now entered Marineford at the head of hundreds of escaped prisoners. The fleet admiral could no longer allow the world to view him as an ordinary rookie. Sengoku announced Luffy's identity across the battlefield. Monkey D. Luffy was the grandson of Garp the hero. He was also the son of Monkey D. Dragon, the leader of the Revolutionary Army, and the man the world government considered its most dangerous enemy. Shock spread through the Marines and pirates alike. Ivankov had learned the same truth during the escape from Impel Down, but many of the prisoners accompanying Luffy heard it for the first time. The revelation only increased their belief that the young pirate was destined to become someone extraordinary. Luffy paid no attention. Neither Dragon's name nor Garp's reputation could bring him closer to the execution platform. He stretched his arms through the Marine lines, knocking soldiers aside and pulling himself forward across the battlefield. Blades cut his skin, bullets passed close to his body, and explosions broke the ice beneath him. Still, he continued. High above the plaza, Ace watched his brother endure every attack. The sight brought him no relief. He had already seen oars fall and Whitebeard's allies bleed for him. Now Luffy had entered the same battlefield, throwing himself against enemies whose strength far exceeded his own. Ace told Garp that he would no longer resist whatever happened. If the pirates reached him, he would accept being rescued. If the executioners killed him first, he would accept death. He could no longer reject the hands reaching toward him from every direction. Across the ice, Gecko Moria moved to intercept Luffy. The warlord still remembered his defeat upon Thriller Bark and wanted revenge against the pirate who had destroyed his plans. Shadows gathered around Moria while his remaining zombies rushed into Luffy's path. Jinbei stepped between them. He had once held the same title as Moria, but he had surrendered his position rather than participate in Ace's execution. Using fishman karate, Jinbei struck through the zombies and forced Moria backward. When Moria drew shadows from nearby Marines to strengthen his body, Jinbei attacked again, releasing a powerful blow that drove the stolen shadows out of him. Luffy continued running. Smoke suddenly spread across the ice. Smoker appeared within it, gripping his sea-stone-tipped weapon. He had pursued Luffy since their meeting in Logtown, and understood that ordinary attacks could not stop the rubber pirate for long. His jitty struck Luffy and drained the strength from his body. Smoker pinned him against the ground. Luffy attempted to fight back, but his fists passed harmlessly through Smoker's smoke. Without haki, he had no way to touch the Marine officer's true body. Smoker raised his weapon to end the struggle. A powerful kick struck him from the side. Boa Hancock stood between Smoker and Luffy, her expression filled with anger. To the watching Marines, her interference was an act of betrayal against the government that had summoned her. Hancock did not care. No one was permitted to harm the man she loved. Smoker recovered and confronted her, but Hancock continued blocking his path. While the two faced one another, she secretly gave Luffy the key she had taken for Ace's sea-stone handcuffs. Luffy thanked her with a sudden embrace before racing onward. Hancock remained behind, overwhelmed by the simple gesture, while Smoker realized that the Pirate Empress had chosen Luffy over her duty as a warlord. Elsewhere, Ivankov found another familiar face upon the battlefield. Bartholomew Kuma had once fought beside Dragon's revolutionary army. Ivankov called to him, expecting some sign that the enormous man remembered their shared past. Kuma answered with a beam of destructive light. Ivankov avoided the blast and demanded an explanation, but Kuma showed no recognition. His expression remained empty, and every movement followed the cold precision of a machine. Doflamingo watched their confusion with amusement. He explained that the person Ivankov remembered no longer existed. Dr. Vegapunk's final modifications had erased Kuma's will and personality, leaving behind a human weapon completely obedient to the world government. Ivankov stared at the silent figure before him. The body belonged to Kuma, but the man inside it was gone. Luffy passed nearby and recognized Kuma as the warlord who had separated the Straw Hat crew at Sabaody. He had no time to understand why the man now seemed different. Ace was still waiting. The key to his chains was hidden safely against Luffy's body, and the path ahead remained filled with some of the world's strongest fighters. As Luffy ran toward the plaza, a long black blade slowly turned in his direction. Dracule Mihawk had decided to test whether fate would allow the young pirate to continue. Dracule Mihawk stepped into Luffy's path, with the black blade Yoru resting in his hands. He had watched the young pirate survive Impel Down, fall into the center of Marineford, and gather powerful allies around him, almost without trying. Now Mihawk wished to see whether that strange fortune would continue protecting him when the strongest sword in the world was turned against him. Luffy understood immediately that he could not afford to stop and fight. Ace remained far above the plaza, and every second spent facing Mihawk brought the execution closer. Luffy activated Gear Second and tried to race around him, but Mihawk's sword moved with frightening speed. A single swing sent a cutting force across the frozen bay, splitting the ice and forcing Luffy away from the path he had chosen. Luffy prepared to stretch both arms forward, hoping to strike from a distance. At the last instant, he imagined the black blade cutting through them before his attack could land. He stopped himself and pulled back. Mihawk noticed the decision. Luffy was reckless, but he was not moving without thought. Even in the middle of the war, he could recognize an attack that would cost him both arms. Jinbei rushed between them and met Mihawk's blade with his hardened hands. The former warlord held his ground for only a moment before Mihawk's strength sent him flying across the ice and into the water below. Luffy called after him, but there was no time to turn back. Mihawk was already lifting his sword again. Buggy happened to be nearby, surrounded by the escaped prisoners who still believed every accident around him was part of a brilliant plan. Luffy seized him and held him in front of the approaching Slash. Mihawk's blade cut Buggy into several pieces, but the chop-chop fruit allowed the clown pirate to remain unharmed. Furious at being used as a shield, Buggy threw one of his small explosive weapons toward Mihawk, only for the swordsman to calmly deflect it back into him. Luffy escaped through the smoke, but another Slash followed. Mr. One stepped into its path, transforming his body into steel and blocking the attack that would have reached Luffy. For a moment, Daz's bones remained standing. Mihawk swung again and cut through the steel body, sending him down. Before the swordsman could continue, Crocodile intercepted Yoru with his hook and coldly told Luffy to keep moving. Marco had been watching from nearer the Moby Dick. He understood that Luffy would never reach Ace while Mihawk remained free to pursue him. Marco called for Vista, the swordsman of Whitebeard's 5th Division. Vista crossed the battlefield and caught Mihawk's black blade between his two swords. The greatest swordsman in the world recognized Vista's name, while Vista calmly accepted the challenge of holding him back. Luffy ran on while the two swordsmen traded precise, powerful blows behind him. Around them, the Whitebeard Pirates continued opening paths through the marine lines, but a new force had begun appearing at the rear of the Allied fleet. Under Sentomaru's command, rows of identical giants stepped onto the battlefield. They carried Kuma's face, metal bodies, and the ability to fire beams of light. The Marines' army of pacifistas had arrived. The pacifistas advanced from the rear of the battlefield in a silent line. To many of the pirates, it appeared that Bartholomew Kuma had somehow divided himself into an entire army. Each machine possessed the same enormous body, the same expressionless face, and the same paw-shaped markings upon its hands. Then light gathered inside their mouths. Beams tore across the frozen bay. Explosions erupted among Whitebeard's allied crews, throwing pirates into the air and breaking the ice beneath their feet. Men who had been charging toward the execution platform were suddenly forced to turn and defend themselves against the mechanical soldiers behind them. Sentomaru walked at the front of the formation, with his enormous axe resting across one shoulder. He explained that the machines were pacifistas, human weapons created through the research of Dr. Vegapunk. They had been built in Kuma's image and equipped with attacks based upon Admiral Kizaru's power. The Allied pirates now found themselves trapped between two armies. The Marine soldiers waited before them near the plaza, while the pacifistas attacked from behind. Every path away from Marineford was being closed. Whitebeard understood Sengoku's plan. The Marines had allowed his fleet to enter the bay and spread across the frozen water. Now they intended to surround the pirates, prevent their retreat, and destroy them while Ace remained beyond their reach. Whitebeard ordered the Allied captains to hold their positions. He knew that panic would destroy them more quickly than the pacifistas. If the crews scattered, the machines would isolate them and cut them down one group at a time. The pirate captains gathered their forces and attacked together. Cannons struck the pacifistas with little effect. Blades cut into their metal bodies, but rarely reached anything vital. Each machine continued walking through the smoke, firing beams into the crowded battlefield. Even experienced pirates struggled against them. Nearer the plaza, Luffy continued moving forward. He could hear the explosions behind him, but he did not stop. Whitebeard's commanders and the Impel Down escapees were creating openings wherever they could, allowing him to pass through lines of Marines that would otherwise have surrounded him. Yet every step became more difficult. Marine officers attacked from both sides. Luffy used Gear Second to move between them, striking one soldier and then another before their weapons could reach him. His body had not fully recovered from the poison and exhaustion of Impel Down, but he forced it to continue. Ace remained visible above him. That was enough. Upon the execution platform, Sengoku studied the battlefield carefully. The pacifistas had entered from the rear. The Allied fleet was crowded inside the bay. Whitebeard's ships had been trapped by the ice, and the Marines still controlled the plaza. The next stage of the plan could begin. Sengoku ordered the public broadcast from Marineford to be stopped. Until that moment, transponder snails had carried the war to people watching throughout the world. Reporters and civilians had witnessed Whitebeard's arrival, the opening attacks, and Luffy's impossible entrance into the battle. Now the government wanted the cameras turned away. What came next was not meant for the world to see. Marine soldiers began disabling the broadcast equipment, but one transponder snail remained beyond their control. Buggy had found it. He held the creature proudly before the escaped prisoners, believing that the entire world was watching him stand at the center of history. His followers praised him as a legendary captain who had challenged both Whitebeard and the Marines. Buggy happily continued the transmission. While the clown pirate dreamed of fame, the Marine defenses began shifting around the bay. Soldiers withdrew toward carefully chosen positions, and hidden machinery moved beneath the stones surrounding the harbor. Whitebeard watched the walls of Marineford. Something was changing. The retreating Marines were not fleeing. They were making room. Across the battlefield, Akainu approached one of Whitebeard's allied captains. Squard had already lost many friends during the war and carried a deep hatred of Gold D. Roger, whose battles had once destroyed the crew he sailed with before joining Whitebeard. Akainu knew this. He also knew that Ace was Roger's son. The Admiral began placing a terrible suspicion inside Squard's mind. He told him that Whitebeard had made a secret agreement with the Marines, that the lives of the Allied captains would be exchanged for Ace's safety and the survival of Whitebeard's own crew. Squard looked across the battlefield. The pacifistas were attacking the Allied ships from behind. The Marine soldiers appeared to be leaving some of Whitebeard's closest commanders untouched. Everywhere he looked, his own men were falling. The lie found a place inside his fear. While Luffy continued running toward Ace, Squard began moving toward the Moby Dick. Whitebeard stood upon its deck, still watching the trap closing around his family. He did not yet know that one of his sons was approaching him with a sword. Squard crossed the deck of the Moby Dick with his sword held low beside him. Whitebeard saw him approaching and did not raise his weapon. Squard was one of the Allied captains who had answered his call, one of the many pirates the old man had accepted as part of his family. Even amid the chaos surrounding Marineford, Whitebeard welcomed him without suspicion. Squard stepped close. Then he drove the sword through Whitebeard's chest. The blade passed completely through the old pirate's body. Blood ran down its edge and struck the wooden deck beneath them. Across the battlefield, pirates and Marines alike froze at the sight of the strongest man in the world, wounded by one of his own sons. Ace cried out from the execution platform. Marco stared in disbelief. In earlier years, Whitebeard would have sensed the attack before Squard came near him. His illness, age, and the strain of fighting without medical support had weakened the instincts that once made such a betrayal impossible. Squard stood before him trembling. He accused Whitebeard of selling out the Allied captains. Akainu had told him that the Marines possessed a secret agreement. Whitebeard would sacrifice the crews outside his inner family in exchange for Ace's life and the safety of the Moby Dick. The lie had been chosen carefully. Squard had once lost everyone he loved in a battle against Goldie Roger. Learning that Ace was Roger's son had reopened that hatred, and the sight of the pacifistas attacking the Allied crews made Akainu's story appear true. Whitebeard looked down at the sword buried inside him. He did not strike Squard. He reached forward and pulled the smaller man into his arms. Squard stiffened in confusion. Whitebeard called him a foolish son, but he did not call him an enemy. He told Squard that even after everything he had done, he was still loved. The words broke through the anger Akainu had placed inside him. Whitebeard asked who had poisoned his heart. When Squard spoke Akainu's name, the old pirate understood the entire plan. The Marines had used Ace's bloodline and the Allied crew's fear to divide his family from within. Whitebeard turned toward the battlefield. He raised his arms and struck the air with the power of the tremor fruit. Cracks spread outward, and the ice surrounding the bay split apart, opening a path toward the sea. The pirates stared at the escape route. Whitebeard told every Allied captain that they were free to leave. If they truly believed he had betrayed them, they did not need to remain and die for him. Each man could decide for himself whether Whitebeard was worthy of being followed. For a moment, the Allied crews hesitated. Then Whitebeard declared that anyone who still wished to save Ace should come with him and risk his life freely. The doubt began to disappear. The captains remembered the years Whitebeard had protected their islands, defended their crews, and treated them as sons. His actions across the battlefield had never been those of a man sacrificing them for his own survival. Squard fell to his knees. The sword slipped from his hands as he realized what he had done. Whitebeard had forgiven him before he could even ask, accepting the wound without abandoning the son who had given it. Ace watched his father standing with blood flowing from his chest. The war had already taken pieces of Whitebeard's strength, but it had not changed the thing that held his family together. Below the execution platform, the Allied pirates raised their weapons once more. Akainu's lie had failed, and Whitebeard stepped down from the Moby Dick, ready to enter the battlefield himself. Whitebeard stepped from the Moby Dick and landed upon the frozen bay. Blood still flowed from the wound Squard had driven through his chest, yet the old pirate stood upright with his bicento resting firmly in one hand. His sons gathered behind him, their earlier uncertainty replaced by the determination to follow their father toward Ace. A giant marine named John Giant moved forward to stop him. He raised an enormous sword and brought it down with enough force to split the ice beneath them. Whitebeard met the attack without retreating. He released the power of the tremor fruit through his weapon, cracking the air and sending a violent shock through the marine giant. John Giant was thrown backward. His massive body crashed across the battlefield, and the path toward the plaza opened before Whitebeard. The Marines began withdrawing. At first, some pirates believed their advance had finally broken the enemy lines. Whitebeard understood differently. The soldiers were not fleeing in panic. They were moving toward positions prepared in advance. A deep, grinding sound rose from beneath Marineford. Massive walls of reinforced metal emerged from the water around the harbor. One after another, the towering barriers surrounded the frozen bay, cutting off Whitebeard's ships and trapping the pirates inside. One section did not rise completely. Little Oars Jr.'s fallen body rested across the mechanism, preventing that part of the wall from closing like the others. A narrow opening remained near the plaza, but everywhere else the pirates found themselves sealed inside the harbor. Whitebeard struck one of the walls. The air cracked beneath the force of his fist, and the entire fortress trembled. Yet the barrier endured even the power of his earthquake. Above the plaza, the three admirals raised their hands and protected the execution platform from the shock. Ace remained beyond the wall, still surrounded by the strongest defenders of Marine headquarters. Akainu lifted both arms toward the sky. His fists transformed into molten magma, and countless burning masses launched upward like a field of fiery stars. They climbed above the frozen bay before beginning their descent. Magma rained down upon the trapped pirates. The burning attacks melted the ice Aokiji had created, stealing the solid ground beneath Whitebeard's forces. Pirates fell into the water as the harbor grew dangerously hot around them. Cannons hidden within the encircling walls opened fire. Explosions struck the crowded bay from every direction. Behind the pirates, the pacifistas remained near the outer routes, leaving almost no safe path of retreat. One mass of magma descended toward the Moby Dick. It struck the ship and burst across its deck. Flames climbed the masts and spread through the vessel that had carried Whitebeard's family across the New World for years. His sons watched their home burn, unable to reach it while the walls continued firing upon them. Ace saw the flames from the execution platform. The Moby Dick had been more than a ship. It had been the place where he first learned that he could belong somewhere without being ashamed of his birth. Now that home was disappearing beneath the fire. Luffy continued searching for a way through the wall. The opening beside oars remained their only chance, but the pirates could not easily cross the burning water or reach the plaza while the hidden cannons continued firing. Then the surface of the harbor began to swell. A coated paddle ship rose from beneath the water. Whitebeard had kept the vessel hidden as a final safeguard. It surfaced among the trapped pirates, providing them with a new place to stand and a possible route toward the opening. Little Oars Jr. moved. Though his body had been pierced, cut, and nearly broken, the giant was still alive. He heard the voices of his friends and understood that the ship needed help reaching the plaza. Oars stretched one enormous hand toward it. With the last of his strength, he lifted the paddle ship from the water and pushed it through the opening beneath his fallen body. The vessel passed beyond the encircling wall. It crashed onto the marine plaza, throwing pirates across the stone, but carrying them closer to Ace than they had been at any moment since the war began. Whitebeard stood among them with his Bicento in hand. Behind him, the Moby Dick burned. Around him, his sons rose from the wreckage and prepared to continue fighting. The Marines' trap had destroyed their ships, melted the frozen bay, and surrounded their fleet. But it had not stopped them from reaching the plaza. Whitebeard's pirates spread across the plaza after breaking through the encircling wall. The execution platform now stood closer than it had at any moment since the war began. But the strongest defenders of Marine headquarters remained between Ace and those trying to save him. Luffy rushed ahead of the others. Then 3 figures stepped into his path. Aokiji, Kizaru, and Akainu stood together beneath the execution platform. The 3 admirals faced the exhausted young pirate, as though the entire weight of Marine headquarters had gathered in one place. Luffy understood the difference in strength between them. He had already been unable to harm Aokiji during their earlier encounter. Kizaru's speed had overwhelmed the Straw Hat crew at Sabaody, and Akainu's magma burned with enough heat to destroy ships and melt the frozen bay. None of that mattered while Ace remained in chains. Luffy seized a broken section of a ship's mast and threw it toward the admirals, hoping to create a momentary opening. The enormous piece of timber spun through the air, but the three men avoided or destroyed it without difficulty. Luffy used the distraction to leap past them. For one brief instant, it appeared that he had succeeded. Golden light flashed beside him. Kizaru struck Luffy and sent him flying backward across the plaza. Whitebeard caught Ace's younger brother before he could crash farther away, while the admiral calmly returned to his position. Luffy struggled against Whitebeard's hand, desperate to continue. The old pirate warned him that reckless courage would not carry him through every enemy. Luffy's body was already covered in wounds, and the strength that had brought him from Impel Down was nearly gone. Above them, Sengoku saw that the battlefield was moving too close to the execution platform. He ordered Ace's execution to proceed immediately. Two executioners raised their weapons over the kneeling prisoner. Ace looked down toward the plaza, where Luffy, Whitebeard, and the others were still trapped below. The blades began to descend. A sudden wave of sand swept across the platform. The executioners were struck aside before their weapons could reach Ace. Crocodile stood below with one arm extended, having used his power to interrupt the execution. The former warlord had once wanted Whitebeard dead, but he refused to allow the Marines to achieve their victory so easily. Whatever hatred Crocodile still carried, he would not stand quietly while the government controlled the outcome of the war. Doflamingo appeared nearby with his familiar smile. He questioned Crocodile's decision to help the Whitebeard Pirates after arriving at Marineford intending to kill their captain. Crocodile answered with hostility, and the two former warlords turned their powers against each other, while Ace remained alive above them. Whitebeard continued forward. Aokiji descended into his path and attempted to freeze him, but Whitebeard shattered the ice spreading around his body with the force of an earthquake. Before the admiral could attack again, Diamond Jozu struck him from the side. Jozu remained behind to face Aokiji, allowing his captain to continue toward the execution platform. Luffy forced himself to run again. Vice Admiral Momonga attacked from one direction, while Dalmatian came from another. Their weapons cut into Luffy before he could escape, and the combined blows sent him stumbling through the plaza. He rose and continued. Another flash of light appeared. Kizaru struck him once more and launched him back toward Whitebeard. This time, Luffy could barely lift his head after landing. Whitebeard looked down at him. The old pirate told him that wanting to rescue Ace was not enough if his body could no longer move. If Luffy continued collapsing, the people around him would be forced to protect him instead of advancing. Luffy tried to stand. His arms shook beneath his weight. His breathing became shallow, and the battlefield blurred before his eyes. He took one unsteady step before his knees finally struck the ground. Ivankov hurried toward him. The revolutionary commander understood that Luffy had reached the limit of the strength forced into him after Magellan's poison. His wounds had not healed, and the exhaustion inside his body could no longer be ignored. Luffy asked for another dose of tension hormones. Ivankov refused. The treatment would not restore what Luffy had lost. It would only force his body to continue moving by hiding the pain and exhaustion for a little longer. When the effect ended, the damage might become even more severe. Luffy looked toward Ace. The executioners had been stopped, but only temporarily. Another pair could be sent to the platform at any moment, and Luffy knew there might never be another opportunity to reach his brother. He told Ivankov that the future meant nothing if Ace died before him. Ivankov hesitated. Then one of his fingers transformed into a long needle. The hormone entered Luffy's body. Pain surged through him as his exhausted muscles were forced back into motion. His breathing steadied, his eyes opened, and strength returned to limbs that should no longer have been able to carry him. The treatment had not healed him. It had only given him a little more time. Luffy rose once again and turned toward the execution platform. Luffy stood once more, his exhausted body moving only because Ivankov's hormones had forced the pain and weakness beneath the surface. The treatment had not healed a single wound. It had merely given him another brief chance to reach Ace before his body failed completely. He began running toward the execution platform. Ivankov followed close behind, sending powerful bursts through the Marine ranks whenever soldiers crowded into Luffy's path. Pirates from Whitebeard's divisions also pushed forward, surrounding Ace's younger brother and creating openings through the battlefield. Above them, another pair of executioners took their places beside Ace. The earlier attempt had been stopped by Crocodile, but Sengoku had no intention of allowing the rescue to continue. Ace's execution would proceed as soon as the new blades were ready. Marco saw them. Blue flames spread across his body as he transformed into a phoenix and launched himself toward the platform. Bullets and cannon fire passed through the regenerative fire surrounding him, his wounds disappearing almost as quickly as the Marines could create them. For a moment, Marco appeared certain to reach Ace. Then Garp moved. The legendary Marine leaped from beside the execution platform and met Marco in the air. His fist struck the Phoenix commander with tremendous force, breaking through the protection of Marco's flames and sending him crashing back into the plaza. Garp landed near the base of the platform. He sat before the path to Ace like an immovable guard, his expression heavy with conflict. The Marines looked toward him with renewed confidence. Whatever pain he carried as Ace's grandfather, Garp was still one of the strongest men Marine headquarters possessed. Marco rose from the broken ground, staring toward the old Marine. Garp had fought Gold D. Roger many times and survived every encounter. Even Whitebeard's commanders could not simply pass him while he defended the execution platform. Elsewhere, Whitebeard attempted to move forward. A sudden pain seized his chest. His enormous body stopped as his illness struck in the middle of the battlefield. Blood rose from his mouth, and the strongest man in the world was forced briefly to one knee. Akainu seized the opening. Magma gathered around the Admiral's arm before he drove his burning fist into Whitebeard's chest. Fire tore through the old pirate's body, deepening the wounds that already covered him. Whitebeard remained standing. Marine soldiers surrounded him with swords, guns, and cannons. They attacked from every direction while the old pirate gripped his Bicento and endured each blow without retreating. His commanders saw their father wounded. Marco turned away from his own battle for only an instant. Vice Admiral Onigumo approached from behind and fastened a sea-stone cuff around his wrist, taking away the power that allowed his phoenix flames to heal him. Kizaru fired beams of light through Marco's body. Without his regeneration, the attacks pierced him and sent him falling to the ground. Jozu also looked toward Whitebeard. Aokiji used that moment of distraction to freeze the Diamond Commander completely. Ice spread over Jozu's body until he stood motionless, and part of his arm shattered when he fell upon the frozen ground. The Whitebeard Pirates were losing their strongest defenders, one after another. Luffy continued running. Kobe stepped into his path. The young Marine's body trembled, but he forced himself to remain standing. Long ago, Luffy had helped him escape from Alvida and inspired him to pursue his dream of becoming a marine officer. Now that dream had placed them on opposite sides of the battlefield. Kobe attacked. Luffy struck him with a single punch. There was no anger in the blow, and no time to speak about the friendship they once shared. Kobe fell across the stone, and Luffy continued toward Ace without slowing. The executioners raised their blades. Luffy saw the weapons above Ace's head. He was still too far away. His legs could not carry him there in time, and no attack could cross the distance before the blades fell. A desperate command rose from deep within him. "Stop!" An invisible force burst outward from Luffy. The executioners collapsed before their weapons could reach Ace. Marines throughout the plaza fell unconscious where they stood, their swords and rifles slipping from their hands. For a moment, the entire war seemed to grow quiet. The admirals looked toward Luffy with new interest. Garp recognized the power immediately. Sengoku's expression tightened, while Whitebeard stared at the young pirate who had once again prevented Ace's death. Luffy had released Conqueror's Haki, the rare will possessed by those born with the qualities of a king. Luffy himself did not understand what he had done. He only saw that Ace was still alive. Whitebeard raised his voice across Marineford. He ordered every pirate under his command to protect Luffy and clear a path toward the execution platform. The commanders, allied captains, and remaining pirates answered together. From that moment onward, the full strength of Whitebeard's family gathered around one purpose. They would carry Luffy to Ace. The strange pressure faded from Marineford, leaving hundreds of unconscious soldiers scattered across the plaza. Luffy stood among them, breathing heavily and staring toward the execution platform. He did not understand the power that had just escaped from him. He only knew that the executioners had fallen and Ace was still alive. Around the battlefield, the strongest warriors understood far more. The admirals watched Luffy with new caution. Garp lowered his eyes, recognizing the same rare will carried by people capable of standing above others. Whitebeard studied the young pirate for only a moment before raising his voice across the plaza. He ordered every one of his sons to protect Luffy. The Whitebeard Pirates answered immediately. Commanders and allied captains forced their way through the marine ranks, opening a narrow path toward the scaffold. Pirates threw themselves between Luffy and approaching officers, accepting wounds they might otherwise have avoided so that Ace's younger brother could continue moving. Luffy ran through the opening they created. The borrowed strength from Ivankov's hormones still burned inside him, but his body was weakening beneath it. Blood marked his path across the stone, and each breath became more painful than the last. He refused to slow down. Marines rushed toward him from both sides. Ivankov released powerful blasts that swept several soldiers away. Jinbei struck through another group with Fishman Karate. Crocodile used his sand to interfere with anyone attempting to close the path. Even men who had once fought against Luffy were now helping him reach Ace. The battlefield had begun gathering around his determination. Above them, Sengoku watched the advance with growing urgency. Luffy had already survived far longer than anyone expected. If he reached the platform, the entire purpose of the Marines' operation could collapse before the eyes of the world. More soldiers were ordered forward. The remaining Whitebeard commanders met them. Weapons clashed around Luffy while he continued toward the base of the towering scaffold. The platform rose above him like a great stone wall, too high to reach quickly even with his stretching arms. Then Ivankov's hair began to move. Inazuma emerged from where he had been recovering. The revolutionary had been gravely weakened by Magellan's poison during the escape from Impel Down, but he had survived hidden within Ivankov's enormous hair. Now he looked toward Luffy and understood what was needed. Inazuma extended the blades of his hands. Using the power of the snip-snip fruit, he cut through a massive section of the stone plaza as though it were cloth. The severed ground folded upward beneath his control, bending into a long bridge that climbed directly toward the execution platform. The path to Ace opened before Luffy. He leaped onto the stone bridge and began running upward. Ace watched his brother drawing closer. For the first time, there were no walls, armies, or admirals directly between them. Only the last stretch of rising stone remained. Then a powerful figure landed upon the bridge. Garp stood in Luffy's path. The old marine's coat moved in the wind while his fists tightened at his sides. Below him stood his grandson. Behind him knelt the young man he had raised as family. The entire battlefield seemed to narrow around the three of them. Luffy slowed. He had faced Garp many times during his childhood, though never as an enemy in war. His grandfather had thrown him into ravines, left him in dangerous forests, and struck him with fists that somehow hurt despite Luffy's rubber body. Every harsh lesson had been Garp's attempt to make him strong. Every argument had ended with Garp insisting that both Luffy and Ace would become great marines. Neither had obeyed. Now their chosen paths had brought them to opposite sides of Marineford. Garp told Luffy that he would have to defeat him to pass. He was a vice admiral of the Marines. He could not simply step aside while a pirate freed the condemned son of Goldie Roger. The soldiers below were watching him, and justice demanded that he defend the platform. Luffy shouted that he did not want to fight his grandfather. Garp shouted back that choices carried consequences. If Luffy truly intended to become a pirate and save Ace, then he would have to strike down the man who had tried to guide him toward another life. Luffy continued running. Garp drew back his fist. Memories passed through the old marine's mind. He remembered Ace as a child, angry at a world that hated him before it knew him. He remembered Luffy shouting about becoming the Pirate King. He remembered watching them grow, fight, laugh, and ignore every future he had planned for them. His fist moved forward. So did Luffy's. At the final instant, Garp's strength failed him. The legendary marine who had fought the Pirate King could not bring himself to strike his grandson with everything he possessed. Luffy's fist connected with Garp's face. The old man was thrown from the bridge and fell toward the plaza below. Sengoku watched him fall and understood what had happened. Garp had chosen his duty for as long as he could. But in that final moment, his heart had chosen his family. Luffy reached the top of the bridge. The execution platform stood directly before him. Ace lifted his head as his younger brother climbed onto the scaffold at last. Luffy climbed onto the execution platform and hurried toward Ace. For the first time since entering Marineford, no army stood between them. Ace remained kneeling with his wrists locked inside sea-stone handcuffs, staring at the younger brother who had crossed an ocean, invaded the world's greatest prison, and fought through the full strength of Marine headquarters to reach him. Luffy dropped beside him and pulled out the key Boa Hancock had secretly given him. Before the key could enter the lock, a narrow beam of light crossed the platform. Kizaru had seen what Luffy was attempting. The beam struck the small key and shattered it between Luffy's fingers, scattering the pieces across the stone. Below, the pirates cried out in frustration. Luffy had reached Ace, yet the sea stone restraints still held his brother powerless. Sengoku stepped forward. Until then, the fleet admiral had directed the battle from beside the scaffold, watching Whitebeard's forces break through each carefully prepared defense. Now the rescue had reached the platform itself. Golden light surrounded Sengoku as his body expanded into the form of a colossal Buddha, towering over Luffy, Ace, and the executioners. He raised one enormous fist, prepared to crush the platform before Ace could be freed. A familiar figure suddenly emerged beside the brothers. Mr. 3 had disguised himself as one of the executioners, intending at first to remain hidden amid the confusion. Yet, memories of Bon Clay's sacrifice at Impel Down had followed him into the war. He could not watch Luffy come so far and then abandon him at the final moment. Using the wax fruit, Mr. 3 quickly formed a new key shaped to fit Ace's handcuffs. Sengoku's fist descended. Luffy inflated his body with Gear 3rd, becoming an enormous balloon that shielded Ace and Mr. 3 from the direct force of the blow. The impact shattered the execution platform beneath them. Great pieces of stone and timber broke away, and the entire scaffold began collapsing toward the plaza, while smoke and debris swallowed everyone standing upon it. They fell through the wreckage. Mr. 3 held the wax key with trembling hands and reached for Ace's restraints as the broken platform tumbled around them. The key entered the lock. The sea stone cuffs opened, and after so many days of imprisonment, Ace's arms were finally free. Strength returned to him almost immediately as the power of the flame fruit awakened throughout his body. Fire burst across the falling debris. Ace spread his flames around Luffy and Mr. 3, protecting them from the explosion as they descended. A great column of fire rose from the ruined scaffold, bright enough to be seen from every corner of Marineford. Marines and pirates stopped to look toward it, uncertain for one breath whether the rescue had succeeded. Two figures emerged from the flames and landed together upon the plaza. Luffy stood beside Ace, bruised and exhausted, but smiling with relief. Ace's hands were no longer chained, and fire moved freely around his body once more. When Marine soldiers rushed toward them, the brothers attacked side by side, combining rubber and flame as they had once fought together in childhood. Against every defense Marineford had placed before them, Portgas D. Ace had finally been freed. Ace and Luffy landed together upon the shattered plaza as smoke rolled away from the ruined execution platform. The sea stone chains were gone, and fire once again moved freely around Ace's arms. For the first time since the battle began, the Whitebeard Pirates could see the person they had come to save, standing beyond the reach of his executioners. The Marines closed around the brothers immediately. Ace stepped in front of Luffy and swept flames across the plaza, driving back the nearest soldiers. Luffy fought beside him, stretching his arms through the smoke and striking anyone who attempted to block their retreat. Their movements carried the familiar trust of two brothers who had once spent their childhood testing their strength against one another. For a brief time, they advanced together. Ace's flames protected Luffy whenever his exhausted body became too slow to avoid an attack. Luffy's unpredictable movements opened paths through the Marines gathering around them. After everything separating them, the execution platform, the admirals, and the full military power of the government, they were finally fighting side by side again. Whitebeard watched from farther across the battlefield. Ace had been freed. The one purpose that brought his family to Marineford had been accomplished. Every additional moment they remained only increased the number of sons who might never return home. Whitebeard planted his Bicento into the broken stone. His voice passed over the plaza and reached every commander, allied captain, and pirate still fighting beneath his flag. He announced his final order as captain. The Whitebeard Pirates were to leave Marineford immediately. They would protect Ace, return to the New World, and continue sailing without him. Whitebeard would remain behind. His sons reacted with disbelief. Marco understood what their father intended, but accepting it was another matter. Whitebeard had entered the war already weakened by age and illness. Since then, he had been stabbed through the chest, burned by Akainu's magma, struck by blades, and fired upon by countless Marines. He did not expect to leave the island alive. The commanders called out to him, refusing to abandon the man who had given them a family. Whitebeard silenced them with another command. Every person reached a moment when the next generation had to continue without them. Whitebeard's era was nearing its end, but the lives of his sons still stretched beyond Marineford. He would not allow them to waste those lives by remaining beside him simply because they were afraid to say farewell. The pirates began retreating. Ace stopped. Luffy called for him to keep moving, but Ace slowly turned back toward the old man standing alone before the Marines. The battlefield between them was filled with smoke, fire, and the bodies of people who had risked everything to bring him home. Ace remembered when he first boarded the Moby Dick. He had challenged Whitebeard repeatedly, trying to defeat the Emperor whose name stood above the seas. Whitebeard had answered each attack without hatred, and continued offering Ace a place among his sons. For most of his life, Ace had wondered whether he deserved to exist. The blood of Gold D. Roger had made him believe that the world would always judge him before knowing him. Whitebeard had never cared whose child Ace had been at birth. He had simply accepted him. Whitebeard looked back toward Ace. The strength in the old pirate's voice softened. He asked Ace one final question. Had he been a good father? The words reached Ace more deeply than any wound. Tears gathered in his eyes as memories of the Moby Dick returned to him. The shared meals, the battles, the laughter of his brothers, and the man they had all called father. Ace lowered his head. He answered that Whitebeard had been the greatest father anyone could have asked for. The pirates cried out in agreement. Across the battlefield, Whitebeard smiled. He had spent his life gathering people who had nowhere else to belong. He had never wanted treasure or a throne as much as he wanted a family. Now that family was carrying his beloved son away from Marineford. Ace turned back toward Luffy. The brothers continued toward the bay with the retreating pirates, while Whitebeard remained behind them, standing between his children and the full power of Marine headquarters. Ace and Luffy followed the retreating pirates, while Whitebeard remained behind, facing Marine headquarters alone. The path toward the bay had finally opened, and the family that had come to rescue Ace began carrying its wounded away from the battlefield. For several precious moments, it seemed that the impossible had been achieved. Ace was free. Luffy was beside him, and Whitebeard's final order might allow his sons to escape. Then Admiral Akainu spoke from behind them. He mocked the retreating pirates and called Whitebeard a failure from a forgotten age. Roger had become the pirate king, Akainu said, while Whitebeard had spent his life gathering followers and pretending to rule a family. Now those same followers were running away, leaving their captain to die without ever claiming the greatest treasure upon the sea. Luffy urged Ace not to listen. The insult had been chosen to stop him. Every second Ace remained upon the battlefield placed him and everyone around him in greater danger. Yet Ace could not continue walking while someone dishonored the man who had given him a home. Whitebeard had accepted him when he believed his very existence was a mistake. To Ace, allowing those words to pass unanswered felt like betraying the father he loved. Ace turned around. Fire gathered around his fist as he confronted Akainu. He declared that Whitebeard had created the age they were living in, and that no insult could erase the lives his father had protected. Ace attacked, sending flames across the broken plaza. Akainu answered with a fist of molten magma. Fire and magma collided. Ace's flames disappeared beneath the greater heat. The impact threw him backward, his hand burned by a power that could consume even fire itself. Akainu looked past him toward Luffy and decided that the son of Dragon should not be allowed to leave Marineford alive. Luffy tried to move. The strength forced into his body by Ivankov's hormones finally began to fail. His knees struck the ground, and the small piece of Ace's Vivre card slipped from his hand. Luffy reached for it instinctively, his body no longer responding quickly enough to the danger approaching him. Akainu raised his burning fist. Ace saw the attack before Luffy did. He placed himself between the Admiral and his younger brother. The magma fist passed through Ace's body. For one silent moment, Luffy remained kneeling beneath him, unable to understand what had happened. Then Ace collapsed against his brother. The heat had destroyed his organs, leaving a wound that even Marco's healing flames could not repair. Across the battlefield, Whitebeard's commanders cried out. Garp surged to his feet in fury, but Sengoku forced him down before he could attack Akainu. Marco and Vista rushed forward to protect the brothers, while Jinbei and the others tried desperately to create enough space around them. Luffy held Ace in his arms. He begged his brother to stand, reminding him that they had promised to escape together. Ace spoke softly, knowing that his life was ending. He regretted only that he would never see Luffy achieve his dream. Then he asked Luffy to carry his final words to Dadan and to the friends who had cared for him. Ace looked toward the Whitebeard Pirates. All his life, he had searched for an answer to one question: whether someone born from the blood of Gold D. Roger deserved to exist. The answer now surrounded him in the tears of his brother and the cries of the family that had crossed the sea to save him. Ace smiled. He thanked everyone for loving him. The last piece of his Vivre card burned away, and Portgas D. Ace became still in Luffy's arms. Ace's body rested against Luffy as the last fragment of his Vivre card disappeared into the air. Luffy stared at his brother's peaceful face. His mouth opened, but no sound came at first. The battlefield around him blurred beneath a grief too large for his exhausted mind to understand. He had crossed every barrier placed before him and reached Ace in time. He had broken the chains and begun the journey home beside him. Yet Ace was gone. A broken cry finally escaped Luffy. Then his eyes emptied. The strength granted by Ivankov's hormones vanished along with his will to continue. His body collapsed beside Ace, no longer responding to the explosions or the fighting surrounding him. Akainu stepped toward them. Ace's death had not satisfied his absolute justice. Luffy carried the blood of Monkey D. Dragon and had already shown the rare haki of a conqueror. The Admiral believed allowing him to escape would create another threat to the world government. Marco and Vista rushed forward. Their attacks struck Akainu with haki, but the admiral's magma body endured. He continued advancing until Jinbei reached Luffy and lifted the unconscious young pirate into his arms. Jinbei promised Ace that he would protect his brother. He turned away from the battlefield and began carrying Luffy toward the sea while the remaining commanders formed a defense around them. Whitebeard had seen everything. He had seen Ace freed. He had watched his son turn back to defend his name. And now he saw Ace lying motionless upon the broken ground. The old pirate approached Akainu without speaking. For the first time, the admiral sensed the enormous shadow behind him too late. Whitebeard's fist descended upon Akainu's head. The power of the tremor fruit cracked the air and drove the admiral into the ground. The stone beneath them shattered, and the force of the blow rolled across Marineford like an earthquake. Akainu rose from the ruins and retaliated. Molten power struck Whitebeard, burning away another part of the old pirate's already wounded body. Whitebeard did not retreat. He seized the air beside Akainu and struck again with all the grief and rage he had carried in silence. Marine headquarters split apart. A great chasm opened across the plaza, dividing Whitebeard from his retreating sons. Akainu fell into the darkness below, while the broken earth created a final barrier between the Marines and the pirates attempting to escape with Luffy. Whitebeard remained on the enemy's side. His final order had not changed. His sons were to leave without him. Then laughter echoed above the ruined fortress. A group of prisoners appeared upon the remains of the execution platform. At their center stood Marshal D. Teach, the pirate who had once sailed beneath Whitebeard's flag. Blackbeard had used his title as a warlord to enter Impel Down. In its deepest level, he had freed some of the world's most dangerous criminals and invited them to join his crew. Now he had brought them to Marineford. Whitebeard looked upon the man whose betrayal had begun everything. Teach had murdered Thatch to steal the dark fruit. Ace had pursued him, been defeated, and delivered to the government. The execution, the war, and the death of Whitebeard's beloved son all traced back to the smiling pirate standing before him. Blackbeard greeted his former captain with confidence. He raised one hand and released the darkness of his devil fruit. When Whitebeard attacked, Teach caught him and temporarily pulled away the power of the tremor fruit. For a moment, Blackbeard believed he had become untouchable. Whitebeard struck him with his Bicento. The blade cut across Teach's body and threw him to the ground. Blackbeard screamed in pain as Whitebeard placed one enormous hand around his throat. The old pirate gathered earthquake power directly against him. Teach begged for mercy. He called Whitebeard his father and reminded him that he had once been his son. Whitebeard looked down without forgiveness. Teach was the only man Whitebeard had ever refused to call his son. He told him that he was not the person Gold D. Roger had been waiting for. Then Whitebeard released the tremor. The blast crushed Teach into the ground, but the old pirate no longer possessed enough strength to finish him. Blackbeard staggered backward and ordered his entire crew to attack. Gunfire filled the air. Blades and spears pierced Whitebeard from every direction. Teach and his new companions continued firing and striking until smoke completely covered the strongest man in the world. When the weapons finally became quiet, Whitebeard was still standing. He thought of Roger and the final conversation they had once shared. Roger had told him about the mysterious initial carried by certain people and about the inherited will passing through history. Whitebeard looked across Marineford. He declared that even if someone erased a person's bloodline, the flames of that person's will could never be extinguished. Someday, A great battle would engulf the entire world when someone finally discovered the treasure Roger had left behind. Sengoku shouted for him to stop. Whitebeard drew one final breath. "The One Piece exists!" His voice crossed the battlefield and traveled through the surviving broadcast to people throughout the world. Then Edward Newgate died. He did not fall. Even after receiving hundreds of wounds, cannon blasts, and bullets, his enormous body remained upright. Not one injury marked his back, because Whitebeard had never turned away from an enemy. The age had lost one of its greatest pirates. But with his final words, Whitebeard ensured that the era of dreams would continue without him. Whitebeard remained standing after death, his final declaration still echoing across Marineford. For several moments, even the Marines seemed unable to look away. Then Blackbeard ordered his crew to cover the Emperor's body with a large black cloth. Teach disappeared beneath it alone, hiding whatever he intended to do from every watching eye. No one understood why he needed Whitebeard's body or what his strange darkness could accomplish. The battlefield waited while the cloth moved softly in the wind. When Blackbeard emerged, he was laughing. He raised one hand and darkness gathered around it as before. Then he raised the other and struck the empty air. Cracks spread outward from his fist. The sea tilted, the damaged fortress shook, and the same earthquake power that had belonged to Whitebeard rolled across Marineford. Pirates and Marines stared in horror. Blackbeard now possessed both the dark fruit and the tremor fruit, something no person was believed capable of surviving. Teach declared that the age belonged to him. He had spent years aboard Whitebeard's ship waiting for the dark fruit to appear. He had betrayed Thatch, captured Ace, used the government to enter Impel Down, and gathered a crew of prisoners from its deepest level. Every step had led him to Whitebeard's final power. Now he began striking Marineford with earthquakes, laughing as the fortress broke around him. Sengoku transformed into his golden Buddha form and released a shockwave against the Blackbeard Pirates, refusing to let Teach destroy the island unchecked. Far from that clash, Jinbei continued carrying Luffy toward the sea. Luffy remained unconscious in his arms, his face empty after Ace's death. Jinbei could feel how weak the young pirate had become, but there was no time to stop. Akainu climbed from the chasm Whitebeard had opened and resumed his pursuit. The Admiral had survived the Emperor's attacks, and his determination to erase Dragon's son had not weakened. Molten rock burned around his body as he moved through every pirate who tried to slow him. Marco and the remaining Whitebeard commanders gathered between Akainu and Luffy. Their father and brother had both died, but Whitebeard's final order still remained. They were to protect the future and leave Marineford alive. The commanders attacked together, forcing Akainu to fight through them while Jinbei carried Luffy farther away. Even wounded and grieving, they refused to allow the Admiral to reach the person Ace had died protecting. Akainu found another opening and appeared behind Jinbei. Jinbei turned his body so that Luffy would not receive the full force of the attack. The Admiral's magma fist passed through Jinbei's back and burned into Luffy's chest. Jinbei nearly lost consciousness, but his arms remained locked around the young pirate. The promise he had made to Ace mattered more than the pain spreading through his body. He would not release Luffy, even if carrying him cost his own life. Crocodile intervened before Akainu could strike again. Sand swept across the battlefield and separated the Admiral from Jinbei. The force threw Jinbei and Luffy through the air toward Buggy, who had been attempting to escape while preserving his image before the prisoners following him. Buggy caught the two injured men in pieces of his separated body, complaining in terror even as he carried them toward the edge of the bay. Behind him, the Whitebeard commanders continued holding Akainu back. A submarine rose from the water beyond the ruined harbor. Trafalgar Law stood upon its deck and called for Luffy to be brought aboard. Though he and Luffy were rival pirates, Law was also a skilled doctor, and he declared that the Straw Hat would die without immediate treatment. Buggy threw Jinbei and Luffy toward the submarine, where Law's crew caught them and rushed them inside. The vessel began descending beneath the sea, while marine attacks followed it into the water. Luffy had escaped the battlefield, but the war above Marineford had still not ended. The fighting continued even after Ace and Whitebeard were gone. Marineford had already been shattered. The plaza was broken, the bay was filled with burning wreckage, and countless wounded men lay scattered between the remaining forces. The Marines had completed Ace's execution, and the Whitebeard Pirates were attempting to retreat. Yet soldiers and pirates continued taking one another's lives as though no one remembered how the battle had begun. Beneath the surface of the sea, Trafalgar Law's submarine carried Luffy and Jinbei away from the island. Law began treating their terrible injuries while his crew guided the vessel through the dark water. Above them, Aokiji froze part of the sea in an effort to stop their escape, while Kizaru fired beams of light toward the fleeing submarine. The vessel shook beneath the attacks, but continued moving away from Marineford. On the ruined battlefield, Kobe stood surrounded by voices. Something within him had awakened during the war. He could sense the presences of the people fighting around him, each one reaching his mind like a distant voice. Again and again, those voices vanished as more Marines and pirates were killed. Kobe covered his ears. The silence left behind by every death remained. The original purpose of the battle had already ended. Ace was dead. Whitebeard was dead. Luffy had escaped into the sea. Yet the Marines continued attacking wounded pirates, and the pirates continued defending themselves because surrender would mean death. Doctors waited nearby to treat the injured, but many wounded men would never reach them while the battle continued. Kobe could endure it no longer. The young Marine officer stepped into the open and shouted for everyone to stop. His voice trembled across the battlefield. Kobe accused both sides of wasting lives that could still be saved. Every additional moment of fighting created more wounded soldiers, more dying pirates, and more families who would never see their loved ones return. The battlefield grew quieter around him. Many Marines stared in disbelief. Kobe possessed no authority to end the war. Around him stood admirals, vice-admirals, warlords, commanders, and pirates whose names were known throughout the world. He was terrified. But his fear did not silence him. Admiral Akainu turned toward him. To the admiral, Kobe's plea was an act of cowardice that obstructed absolute justice. The pirates were retreating, and Akainu believed the Marines should destroy every enemy they could still reach. He approached Kobe with magma gathering around his fist. A Marine who interfered with justice, he declared, had no right to live. Kobe closed his eyes. He had known that speaking might cost him his life. Akainu's burning fist came forward. A sword stopped it. The clash sent a shock through the ruined plaza, but Kobe remained unharmed. When he opened his eyes, a red-haired man stood between him and the admiral. Shanks had arrived. The Emperor held his sword against Akainu's magma-covered fist. His presence brought a sudden stillness to the battlefield, as though the war itself had paused to acknowledge him. Shanks looked toward Kobe. He praised the young Marine for the few seconds of courage his words had created. Those precious seconds had allowed Law's submarine to travel farther from Marineford and had given the wounded another chance to survive. The future might have changed because Kobe had been brave enough to speak. Behind Shanks stood the red-haired pirates. Ben Beckman appeared near Kizaru and calmly aimed his rifle toward the admiral. Lucky Roo, Yassop, and the rest of the crew entered Marineford together, prepared to confront anyone who refused to let the battle end. Shanks had not come to claim victory. He had come to stop the war. Blackbeard watched from the remains of the fortress. He now possessed Whitebeard's earthquake power and had gathered some of Impel Down's most dangerous prisoners beneath his flag. Yet when Shanks challenged those who still wished to fight, Teach decided that the time had not yet come for a confrontation between them. The Blackbeard Pirates withdrew. Shanks turned toward the Marines and the retreating pirates. Anyone who insisted upon continuing the battle would have to face the red-haired pirates as well. Neither side could pretend that the deaths of Ace and Whitebeard had left anything meaningful to gain. Sengoku studied the Emperor in silence. The Marines had already lost countless soldiers. Their headquarters had nearly been destroyed, and beginning another battle against a second Emperor would only spread the devastation farther. At last, Sengoku made his decision. He ordered the Marines to lower their weapons. The war was over. Doctors hurried toward the wounded, and soldiers began gathering their injured companions. The surviving Whitebeard pirates prepared to leave the island where their father and brother had died. Sengoku also agreed to return the bodies of Ace and Whitebeard. They would be given to their families for burial rather than displayed as symbols of the government's victory. Across the plaza, weapons slowly fell. The war that had shaken the world finally became quiet. Shanks recovered Luffy's straw hat. He remembered the young boy in Fuchsia village who had once promised to become a great pirate and return the hat after surpassing him. Shanks chose not to meet Luffy while he remained unconscious. Their promise belonged to another day. He entrusted the hat to be returned safely. The sea surrounding Marineford gradually settled beneath the fading light. Gold D. Rogers' sun was gone. Whitebeard's era had reached its final moment. Blackbeard had risen carrying two impossible powers, and Luffy had escaped with grief that would follow him long after his wounds had healed. Marineford remained broken behind them. Upon that ruined island, one age had ended and another had begun. And with that, the Great War at Marineford finally came to an end. Thank you for spending this journey with Sleepy Otaku Stories. Please kindly like the video and subscribe to the channel for more peaceful, immersive anime retellings. Until our next story, rest well, dream gently, and have a peaceful night.